camp. Counting you, that's 6 men they had at their mercy that we know weren't harmed. So why should they have harmed a 7th man?" Lockley did not answer at once. None of the spared 6, he thought, had put up a fight. Only Vale had exchanged blows with the crew of the spaceship. Nobody else had seen them. "That's right, about Vale," he said, after a moment in which he had been busy. "But this doesn't look good." He felt under the car. He squeezed himself beneath its front end. There was a small, fugitive flicker of flame. It went out, and he was silent. Presently he got to his feet and said evenly, "We're in a fix. One of the front wheels is turned almost at a right angle to the other. A kingpin is broken. The car couldn't be driven, even if I managed to get it up on the road. We've got to walk. There ought to be soldiers on the way up to the lake today. If we meet them, we'll be all right, but this is bad luck." It happened that he was mistaken on both counts. There were no soldiers moving into the park, and it was not bad luck that his car couldn't be driven. If he'd been able to get it on the road and trundling down the highway, the car would have been wrecked and they could very well have been killed. But this was for the future to disclose. They took nothing from the car because they could not see beyond the present. They started out doggedly to follow the highway that soldiers would be likely to follow on the way to the lake. It was not the shortest way to the world outside the park. It was considerably longer than a footpath would have been, but Lockley expected tanks at least, against which eccentric, unearthly weapons would be useless. So they headed down the main highway. Lockley was unarmed. They had no food. He hadn't eaten since the morning before. When day came, gray and still, and presently the dew upon grass and tree leaves glittered reflections of the sky, he moved aside into the woods and found a broken-off branch, out of which, by very great effort, he made a club. When he came back, Jill was listening attentively to the little pocket radio. She turned it off. "I was hoping for news," she explained determinedly. "The government knows that there are creatures in the spaceship, and that would be Vale, will be trying to make them understand what kind of beings we are. So there could be friendly communication almost any time. But there aren't any news broadcasts on the air. I suppose it's too early." He agreed, with reservations. They made their way along the dew-wetted surface of the highway. As the light grew stronger, Lockley glanced again and again at Jill's face. She looked very tired. He reflected sadly that she was thinking of Vale. She'd never thought twice about Lockley. Even now, or especially now, all her thoughts were for Vale. When sunlight appeared on the peaks around them, he said detachedly, "You've had no rest for 24 hours, and I doubt that you've had anything to eat. Neither have I. If troops come up this highway, we'll hear the engines. I think we'd better get off the highway and try to rest. And I may be able to find something for us to eat." There were few wildernesses so desolate as to offer no food at all for one who knows what to look for. There is usually some sort of a berry available. One kind of acorn is not bad to eat. Shoots of bracken are not unlike asparagus. There are some spiny wild plants whose leaves, if plucked young enough, will yield some nourishment, and of course there are mushrooms. Even on stone one can find liverish rock tripe, which is edible if one dries it to complete desiccation before soaking it again to make a soup or broth. Before he searched for food, though, Lockley said abruptly, "You said you saw the creatures, and they weren't men. What did they look like?" "They were a long way away," Jill told him. "I didn't see them clearly. They're about the size of men, but they just aren't men. Far away as they were, I could tell that." Lockley considered. He shrugged and said, "Rest. I'll be back." He moved away. He was hungry, and he kept his eyes in motion, looking for something to take back to Jill. But his mind struggled to form a picture of a creature who'd be the size of a man, but would be known not to be a man even at a distance, whose difference from mankind couldn't be described because seen at such great distance. Presently he shook his head impatiently and gave all his attention to the search for food. He found a patch of berries on a hillside where there was enough earth for berry bushes, but not for trees. Bears had been at them, but there were many left. He filled his hat with them and made his way back to Jill. She had the pocket radio on again, but at the lowest possible volume. He put the berry-filled hat down beside her. She held up a warning hand. Speckles of sunshine trickled down through the foliage and the tree trunks were spotted with yellow light. They ate the berries as they heard the news. A new official news release was out. And now, 12 hours after the last, wholly reassuring bulletin, there was no longer any pretense that the thing in Boulder Lake was merely a meteorite. The pretext that it was a natural object, said the news broadcaster, resuming, had been abandoned. But reassurance continued. Photographic planes had been attempting to get a picture of the alien ship as it floated in the lake. So far, no satisfactory image had been secured, but pictures of wreckage caused by an enormous wave generated in the lake by the alien spaceship's arrival were sharp and clear. Troops have been posted in a cordon about the Boulder Lake Park area to prevent unauthorized persons from swarming in to see Earth's visitors from space. Details of its landing continue to be learned. Workmen from the construction camp have been questioned, and the 2 men who were paralyzed and then released have told their story. So far, 4 human beings are known to have been seized by the occupants of the spaceship. One is Vale, an eyewitness to the ship's descent and landing. The 3 others went to investigate the gigantic explosion accompanying the landing in the lake. They have not been seen since. This, however, does not imply that they are dead. Quite possibly the invaders, aliens, guests, who have landed on American soil are trying to learn how to communicate with the American people who are their hosts. Lockley watched Jill's face. As she heard the references to Vale, she went white, but she saw Lockley looking at her and said fiercely, "They don't know that the visitors didn't kill you and let you and the other 3 men escape. Someone ought to tell these broadcasters." Lockley did not answer. In his own mind, though, there was the fact that of the 2 workmen who had been paralyzed and released, the 3 men in the compost pit shell and himself, none had seen their captors. But Vale had. The broadcaster went on with a fine air of confidence, reporting that yesterday afternoon a helicopter had flown into the mountains to examine the landing site in detail, since it could not be examined from a high-flying plane. Lockley remembered the droning he and the others had heard through the metal plates of their prison. The helicopter had suddenly ceased to communicate. It is believed to have had engine trouble. However, later on, a fast jet had attempted a flight below the extreme altitude of the photographic planes. Its pilot reported that at 15,000 feet he'd suddenly smelled an appalling odor. Then he was blinded, deafened, and his muscles knotted in spasms. He was paralyzed. The experience lasted for seconds only. It was as if he'd flown into a searchlight beam which produced those sensations, and then had flown out of it. He'd instinctively used evasive maneuvers and got away, but twice before he passed the horizon there were instantaneous flashes of the paralysis and the pain. Scientists determined that the report of the men who had been paralyzed and released agreed with the report of the pilot. It was assumed that whatever or whoever had landed in Boulder Lake possessed a beam — it might as well be called a terror beam because of the effects it had — of some sort of radiation which produced the paralysis and the agony. Unless the 3 men missing from the construction camp had died of it, however, it was not to be considered a death ray. The news went on with every appearance of frankness and confidence. It was natural for strangers on a strange planet to take precautions against possibly hostile inhabitants of the newly found world. But every effort would be exerted to make friendly contact and establish peaceful communications,